So good afternoon. I'm Bridget Johnson, Managing Editor of Homeland Security Today, and I apologize for my video problems, but you're not here to see me. You're here to see the Interagency Security Committee. We're very excited to have them here today for this webinar on making a business case for security and ISC best practice. This will describe methodology that includes the development of cost-benefit analysis, to provide recommendations for developing effective methods on best practices for analyzing security costs and benefits and developing and designing cost-effective solutions. These will be demonstrated in the form of a real-world case study that will bring these techniques to life. And I want to introduce our speakers, Daryl Hernandez, Chief of the Interagency Security Committee, Scott Dunford, Senior Security Specialist with the Interagency Security Committee, and Chris York, Compliance Program Policy Analyst with the ISC. And I know that they have a very robust presentation in store for you today. And if you have questions, please either put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we can address them at the end of their presentations. And gentlemen, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks for the introduction. So I want to start off by highlighting that Scott and Chris were both involved with the working group that developed this product, and it's great to have their firsthand account. I want to start by covering a little bit of background about the Interagency Security Committee and kind of what led to the publication of this particular product. The ISC was formed in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing to do two things: to establish security standards and to enhance protection of federal facilities. The ISC has grown from 21 members that were identified in the original executive order to 67 members today. The ISC membership not only has gotten larger, but it's expanded to include the legislative and members from the legislative and judicial branches. The ISC fundamentally uses working groups and subcommittees to fulfill its mission and responsibilities. So I think probably start, Scott, it would be helpful maybe if you could talk a little bit about the working group and what led to this particular topic being tackled by the ISC.
So good afternoon. The ISC membership, they recognize that security professionals really needed a resource or a reference to assist in the development of their security recommendations that they were providing to their organization, especially when they were competing for scarce funding or scarce organizational resources. That really led to the creation of this working group. That working group included not just security professionals, but brought in economists and financial management subject matter experts. And they developed this document that really does three things. First is it demonstrates how to develop a decision-making process to justify your security projects or security programs that you may want to be putting in place. Second thing it does is it shows you how to complete a benefit cost analysis or BCA to support the funding decisions that you're making. And then third, it shows you how it might apply these concepts to specifically the ISC risk management process. We're talking a lot about business case, and obviously that's the title, business case for security. So this is probably a great time to kind of define what a business case is. So Chris, let's bring you in, and why don't you tell us what a business case is?
Yeah, so the working group decided that the definition for a business case for security would be the result of a decision-making process that evaluates benefits, costs, and risks of a preferred solution against alternative options to solve an identified problem. And that was the first step in starting this whole process off. So, sir, would you like to lead us off with what the working group discovered?
Yeah, I mean, the working group discovered that there were 6 common elements to making a successful business case. So regardless of the security investment or the program, the components in these kind of buckets remain the same. It starts with establishing a security project team and ends with actually delivering recommendations to the decision maker.
The first element kind of seems intuitive, but it really is critical, and it can't be overlooked. And that is selecting the right team for the project. And of course, depending on the size or the complexity of your project, is going to determine a lot about your team. But I think that the working group discovered two real key components to formation of a team. And the first is that your team really should expand beyond traditional physical security or facilities specialists. So you may want to reach out to your emergency management managers, maybe information technology, human resources, budget. And I think it's important to include representatives from those lines of business that are going to get impacted by the security project that you're going to undertake, right? And then all good project teams. You want a great project team, you got to have a charter. And that charter should be talking about a level of participation, what's expected for the members of the team, how you're going to communicate, what your project timeline is. And all great charters, of course, have endorsement of leadership. That adds that impetus or that priority to what you're doing. And then, of course, your second element is to do that risk assessment.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to understand risk. You got to be able to articulate risk and the changes in risk that are going to result from your recommendations in order to create a compelling need. Something you may want to do as part of this step is find the particular part of the organization that's responsible for project planning and prioritization to determine whether there are similar initiatives that may be being considered elsewhere within the organization. There's a couple of reasons to do this. The first reason is if you can leverage other offices, if they could benefit from your security recommendation, or if they're considering things that your security recommendation would affect, and you're going to see some examples of that today in terms of the actual case study, then you're going to increase the number of advocates that you have across the organization. The second reason that you want to do this is you might have the opportunity to leverage or bundle things, right? A lot of times security, safety, even sustainability initiatives might come together on a particular, portion of the facility or part of the organization. Glass is a good example of that. There's a security component to it. There's a safety component to it. There's a sustainability component to it. So if we can achieve different goals from different parts of the organization in implementing that one single recommendation, then we're going to be able to show how we're achieving goals across the organization for a singular cost.
Absolutely, Daryl. That would lead us to the third element there, and that's developing the benefit cost analysis. So the BCA is a systematic method of assessing the desirability of security projects when it is important to consider future effects and address possible side effects. It's a decision support tool that documents the predicted effect of actions and incurred costs under consideration to solve a problem or take advantage of an opportunity. So when planning your project timeline, this element is probably where the greatest amount of time is spent, and the guide walks the user through the development of a BCA. The working group looked at a variety of models and found that all good BCAs contain these elements. They describe the project in good detail. They communicate the business impact and also the impact of inaction. They develop alternatives and they analyze benefits and costs. So Scott, that would bring us to the fourth element there, and that's anticipating potential resistance factors. You have to consider any factors that a senior executive would resist in your project and try to build buy-in through the senior executive core. So your readiness to provide appropriate responses and supporting data to any friction points will increase the odds for a more favorable outcome for your project.
Yeah, and then you move on to developing your implementation plan, your schedule, and your performance criteria. And so this is really just describing how your organization is going to execute your security investment strategy. How you're going to break down all the various specific steps along the way. It's going to assign tasks to personnel that are going to be responsible to achieve certain pieces. What's your project schedule? And then finally, it's going to define milestones and those metrics for success.
So, of course, the final element is delivering a great product. And that may seem intuitive, just as Scott mentioned, forming the security project team seems intuitive, but a lot of good ideas with good rationale have died on the floor being delivered to the decision makers. So it really warrants calling it out here and calling it out in the guide and talking a little bit about what's keys to success. Obviously, you want to get that bottom line up front. Your organization is going to have a preferred format. It's probably going to have a preferred forum. Where do decisions get made? Do they get made in large groups? Do they get made in small groups? Your organization will obviously have their preferred format. The keys are well documented, comprehensive, accurate, and credible. And we're going to bring some of those characteristics out when we talk about the benefit cost analysis and we go through the case study for you a little bit later today. So we just mentioned the 9-step OMB cost benefit analysis. Scott, if you could just talk a little bit about why you went with that particular methodology. You mentioned that you considered several within the working group. So why this one?
So first off, the OMB methodology, one thing to understand about it is it's designed primarily for regulatory analysis. However, as the working group looked at the various methodologies out there, they discovered that it can be used to support smaller security related projects. And specifically, the working group found 3 things in particular that they liked. The first is that the process itself is comprehensive and methodical and results in a well-documented analysis, right? Which, that stands on its own why that matters. The second thing is it uses common language. And that's especially important for your federal organizations that they're following and relating the OMB methodology for their security projects really assists organizations that are trying to justify their security needs when they provide that to financial offices who are now analyzing the financial viability. So they're used to seeing this type of language and they understand it better. And then the third thing is it really is fully adaptable. So in the document, actually, they do a demonstration through a case study on how the 9 steps can be used. So I guess kind of following along that theme, let me pose a scenario that we can use to talk through these 9 steps. So let's say we're the security team for a federal facility. We've got a large volume of visitors. There are security concerns regarding how our entrance and our lobby are configured. And we've been asked to look into it and maybe propose some changes to the lobby based on some increasing or emerging risk factors. So using that scenario, Daryl, if we were going to use this 9 steps to develop our business case analysis or benefit cost analysis, what would be our first step?
So first step is to describe the need. I mean, you can see it listed there on the slide. Let's talk a little bit about what that would involve and what we might consider. What's most important about this step is a detailed description of what is needed and why. So where do we go to get the rationale? Where do we go to get the supporting information to build that detailed description? Couple ideas. Vulnerabilities captured on the risk assessment. Clearly, that was one that's alluded to in step 2. We may have compliance requirements with regulatory or other authoritative requirements. We could have an organizational mission change that necessitates us taking some action, or we could have increased mission demands that necessitate us taking some action. It could be things that are routine, such as life cycle replacement or upgrade of a particular protective measure. Hopefully, it doesn't come from system failure or performance lapses, but as long as those are identified, through functionality testing and not through a real-world incident, then we're probably in a better space to take a deliberate approach to this. And then there's always looking at the security landscape. What are other organizations facing? Are there incidents or risks or their newer evolving threats that we're seeing either across our sector or across like types of organization? The key is that the output is a problem or opportunity statement. It could be a problem statement, it could be an opportunity statement, defining the issue and what is the required capability solution. So Scott kind of set us up with a overview of a scenario. Want to go down a little bit farther in terms of detail. So Chris, if you could sort of describe what step one would look like, given the scenario that Scott proposed a few minutes ago.
Absolutely. So as your case study describer, so within our case study, the facility received multiple risk assessments over 9 years, 3 different risk assessments. They all identified the same thing as a vulnerability, and that's the facility entrance, screening area, and the lobby. More specifically, the following items were identified. So we found a substantial number of unscreened personnel queued outside the secure area awaiting entry, exposing them to a variety of risks. We have employees and visitors. They share the same entrance with an intermingled flow pattern, hindering the ability of security force to conduct visual and physical inspection of employee badges prior to entry. Additionally, it exposes employees to unscreened visitors. So the effect of this is an increased risk of a variety of threats, such as active shooter, breach of access control point. We've got theft, unauthorized entry, and assortment of placed explosive devices. And then one of the additional factors in our case study is that we have a state agency has moved in across the street from our federal building, and they are receiving increased threats, and our facilities look very similar. So that is up to the ante of our risk within our facility. We've determined a possible solution, and that's to reconfigure the lobby with additional visitor screening lanes, a separate visitor and employee flow patterns, and then increase security officers and a separate facility just for the visitors that are through the screening area.
So step 2 becomes to define the baseline. Now, in the context of these 9 steps, the primary purpose of the baseline is to provide your decision makers with a picture of the impact or consequence of inaction. So really the baseline represents the current state and the organizational's, kind of a best assessment of what the world would look like absent any specific action. So you're laying out, this is how we currently look. And one of the things that you're also doing with that is you're looking forward and you're saying, are there changes coming to our occupancy? Are there changes coming to our mission? If we stay status quo, how might that look? What would be the consequence if we kind of maintain our baseline? But it's defining how we look today and the potential of just maintaining that and its consequence for us. So Chris, kind of coming back to our scenario, what does our baseline look like?
Yeah, so pictured here, we present the problem statement in the detail required to set the stage for follow-on recommendations. It's further building from our problem statement in step 1. The public, you can see they access the same entrance as our employee. Staff, we have 1 screening lane staffed with 3 security officers, and we've got 4 turnstiles for our employees to come through. Those turnstiles don't have multi-factor authentication at this time. And then we've got a 4th security officer that is in charge of overseeing the security operations at the screening lane, monitoring employee traffic through the turnstiles and verifying badges, and also handling visitor access control beyond the screening lane. And so what we can see here in our baseline is that it exposes us to the risks that I previously mentioned, and we have a high level of burden on our security force with that 4th security officer who is charged with far too many tasks to be effective.
So step 3 is to set the timeline horizon for analysis. So that's going to be a little bit different depending on what our recommendation is, but it's going to need to cover a sufficient time period to comprehensively cover the benefits and costs. Okay, so an example would be if we're going to upgrade a video surveillance system, obviously we want to look beyond just the first year. The first year we're going to have some high costs for installation, but then we need to look at life cycle costs in subsequent years, not just the life cycle costs of a potential new solution, a replacement of the VSS, but also the costs associated with reliability of a new system versus the old system and the need to repair over time. So that on almost every instance, the analysis is going to have to cover a multi-year period to address these life cycle costs, but they also have to address the benefits over this time horizon. So, there are a number of benefits that we might realize out of the solution. We might gain benefits in terms of less costs or labor to maintain. We might do something that's going to increase customer satisfaction or improve capability in some other way or form. Chris, if you could take us in, what's the time horizon for this case study?
As I mentioned, we're going to add additional screening lanes as one of our preferred options. And so with the increase, with the better security screening equipment that we're going to add in, the time frame is going to be set at 10 years based on the life cycle of that equipment.
Step 4 then becomes identifying our range of alternatives. And I think of all 9 steps, this is where the fun actually occurs. And that is simply because this is where you get to be creative. This is where you get to have that blank whiteboard or sticky tabs or however you're doing it. And you get to start coming up with ideas. What are the range of potentially effective solutions or risk mitigation strategies that the team can come up with? And obviously, you're going to be able to eliminate some of the alternatives through some preliminary analysis. And that's going to hopefully leave you a manageable number of alternatives to be evaluated and analyzed more in depth and a little bit further. What's the right number of alternatives you should select for detailed analysis? Really, that's a matter of judgment, probably a matter of the project itself, the type of project you're working on. A couple things about when you're selecting those alternatives. You should probably focus, on your comparative risk analysis, which alternatives bring your risk down the greatest amount, as well as what are going to be some of your major cost drivers to the project you're going to have to consider. Three alternatives is probably a good middle ground. Being able to provide what you would hope be your preferred option. You could, status quo. I mean, doing nothing is always an option. It's always a choice, right? And then a third option might be somewhere that's more or less stringent than your preferred, depending on where it came in. And then it gives you a good, a good list of ways to approach the problem. Chris, again, coming back to our scenario, what were some of the alternatives that were considered with it?
So for the case study, we kept it relatively simple in the document. We used the 3-option scenario, but then I want to point out that when you're doing course of action development for these items, it's important to have enough difference in your courses of action or your alternatives, so you can find a middle ground between a preferred and a middle ground option, or before your status quo and your middle ground. That way, your C-suite has a little bit of an a la carte scenario where they can pick and choose from different options and build up in between. So using the three options that we're following here, we're going to present our preferred option first, and this is everything that addresses all of the risks from the risk assessment. We're going to segregate our flow of employees and visitors into the facility. We're going to add in 2 additional screening lanes, but that is also 3 total new screening systems to increase the productivity of each screening lane. We're going to have a separate visitor control area with a dedicated security officer there. And then we have a dedicated security officer just in charge of overseeing our employee access and control. And then our minimum recommendation, or our second recommendation, is to just add 1 screening lane with an additional 3 screening officers there, and a security officer for the employees that also is just dedicated to them. And you can see here that we don't have a visitor facility built in on the secure side. And as you mentioned, the do nothing approach, just maintaining the status quo. We go back to what our baseline looks like. And in this scenario, we're presenting it to the C-suite so they can say, you know what, we're going to continue to accept all of the risk that's been identified. And that would be the case here.
So at step 5, we're identifying the consequences associated with these alternatives that Chris just briefed you on. Now, Scott talked about, kind of step 4 being sort of the creative piece of that. Well, I would say step 6 is really where the rubber meets the road, right? That's where we're going to identify the costs and the benefits for each of the alternatives that we develop. A couple of ways of thinking about benefits and costs in this regard. You've got costs that can be monetized. We can put a dollar amount on them, and benefits. We have benefits and costs that can be quantified. So we put a number on them, but not necessarily a dollar amount. So they can be quantified, but not monetized. And then we have benefits and costs that cannot be quantified, and they're going to have to be qualified. Part of what you want to look at in this particular step is, in addition to any direct benefits and costs, are there any undesirable side effects or ancillary benefits to any of the alternatives? So I'll define a little bit about what an ancillary benefit would be. An ancillary benefit is where we get a positive impact that's unrelated or secondary to its design purpose. So for example, if we were going to implement an insider threat program, but that program also reduced the likelihood or success of criminal activity, then that's an ancillary benefit, right? It wasn't part of the design of what we're implementing or what we're recommending, but it definitely could be an ancillary benefit. So in order to demonstrate benefits and costs that cannot be quantified, you're going to have to consider things like, does this reduce target attractiveness, right? Does any of these options reduce target attractiveness? Do they reduce consequence? And how are they going to affect vulnerability? So the easiest way to do that, what does the baseline give us today? And then what do the alternatives give us in relation to the baseline? So something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that and this kind of gets back to the comprehensiveness of your security project team, is not those who bear the costs and of these different alternatives, and those who may enjoy the benefits may not be the same. And if you don't get that security project team right, you may not identify that, right? So this is referred to as the distributional effect. So it describes when an impact from an alternative has an effect across the enterprise. And we're going to try to show you some of that as we go a little bit forward in this case study. But definitely, if you get some sort of distributional effect or benefit, make sure you consider that and articulate that in your rationale.
So if we look at this in our case study, the best way to present it is to present the consequences together. And it clearly demonstrates the outcome of our option. So with our preferred option, we address risk from previous risk assessments, and it will have positive outcomes by reducing target attractiveness, or risk of mass casualty events, congestion in public space, and likely enhancing our customer experience with that increased throughput. If we employed option number 2, you can see that we'll still gain enhanced security response and screening capability. However, we have not completely reduced the risk related to high numbers of visitors on the non-secure side of the facility. That leaves unmitigated risk that will continue to be accepted at the facility. And then finally, option 3, that's that do nothing approach, leaves us where we are today, totally accepting all of the risk that's present at this time.
So when we hit step 6, what we're going to do now is quantify and monetize those benefits and costs. And we're going to do it for each one of the options or alternatives. One of the things we want to do is we want to present our benefits and costs in physical units in addition to monetary units, because that's going to provide us a more comprehensive picture of our proposed business case. We want to make sure that we're including things like also our administrative costs and savings, as well as any gains or losses actually in productivity or efficiency, right, that we might have. For me, I kind of see these as tangible benefits. They're quantifiable benefits that that we can assign a numeric value such as dollars, physical counts, or percentage changes. And we're looking at how those would differ once you start or change based on, where you're at from your baseline. So you can physically, look and see and quantify those type of benefits and costs. So Chris, again, coming back to you, how are we looking at that with our case study?
Yeah, so this slide, we show here an example of providing a common set of criteria to demonstrate quantified enhancements to senior leadership. So we want to clearly show our existing throughput of visitors and compare that to our options, which in our scenario includes remaining at the baseline. We can present that accepting one of our recommendations will increase customer throughput, triggering gains in staff productivity as well. So this chart just kind of shows that where we're at with 40 personnel per hour going through that security lane. And if we increase it to the 3 security lanes, we'll end up with 120 visitors being screened per hour. And that's just going to reduce our missed appointments within the facility, increasing our staff productivity. And then on the next slide, we're going to do a detailed analysis and identification of the baseline in step 2, and understanding that it's fundamental to determining additional costs and savings for proposed actions and alternatives. You want to ensure that you consider and present costs already incurred in the baseline assessment. And cost centers include things like costs for operations and sustainment, personnel or support labor costs. You've got information technology costs, you've got preventative maintenance and repair, IT and equipment costs, and then contracting and procurement costs as well. So shown here is a work breakdown structure. This or another cost structure establishes the cost of each recommended element, provides a framework, and reduces the redundancy in cost estimations. You're going to continue to consider like life cycle costs, use resource management plans encompassing all phases of a product's life cycle, all the way from the initial planning stage to deployment to the end user. Further, make sure to document your ground rules and assumptions. We'll go back one slide, Scott. The associated inputs of the preferred option above the baseline, their estimated costs, and assumed life cycles.
Hey, step 7. You kind of going back to that last slide, just kind of a reminder, the working group developed a cost analysis template to assist organizations calculating costs. So that's also available on the website. We're going to show you a QR code. You can go there. And so the goal with that is what you saw there laid out. We pre-built some of the formulas in there so that we could amortize and calculate those costs over time. Discounting. Let's talk about discounting. This is probably, out of this 9-step, this is probably the step that's the most optional. Discounting at the end of the day really involves comparing, it's the time value of money issue, right? Comparing costs and benefits in the past to costs and benefits in the future. Always helpful, but not always required, right? Generally, discounting would be necessary if we're talking a really large period of time, length of time, or if we're talking about a large cost, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars. Then we might get something significant out of discounting. Discounting is not something that you're probably going to get your security specialist to be able to do. This is where you're going to need to bring that budget office into play. You're going to want to probably have somebody with some accounting skills to help you do that. So we show it here within the 9-step summary, but we also tell you it's probably optional, so that if you do need to do discounting because of the length of the time for your proposed recommendation, or because of the cost, that this is something that you may want to consider, and you seek out the folks in your organization that can help you do that.
So at step 8, we're going to evaluate our non-quantified and our non-monetized benefits and costs. So I think we all recognize that there are some benefits and costs, like deterrence of an attack, that do not lend themselves to direct quantitative analysis. So in the security profession, deterrence is a security principle that's been sought after, and you usually get there by hardening your target or reducing your target attractiveness. The ability to deter an attack from occurring, it's really non-quantifiable because of the difficulty in determining the number of attacks that are deterred based on a proposed security measure. So when you're looking at that, you're going to have to rely on a qualitative narrative really to add value to your analysis. We're kind of now in those non-tangible benefits. When it's not possible to quantify or monetize your benefits of a security measure, organizations may choose to do what they call a break-even or a threshold analysis. And that's where you compare the security measure cost and it's with the estimated value of avoiding a successful attack. So in your break-even analysis, what you're doing is you're looking at a particular risk, a particular threat, attack, and you're assuming that it's successful because you have to have a consequence, right? So what are the consequences of that attack? And it might be loss of business for a while. It may be remediation costs to replace, portions of the facility. It may be cost in that you've got injuries to your people. And so you try to put a dollar amount to all of that, and you compare that against your cost to implement that measure. And through that analysis, you're able to start determining, okay, how many of these type of attacks do we have to deter over a certain amount of time to break even with the cost of the security measures we're putting in place.
Hey, Scott, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
How about injuries and loss of life? I mean, how was that kind of figured in?
So really the best way to talk about that is through what they call value of statistical life. There's been a tremendous amount of research and study done on it. It's really not as controversial as it may sound. It's not intended to place a value on human life. Rather, it's intended to discuss what organizations generally are willing to pay to prevent a premature death, right? And if you go to the guide, it links you to some great studies and some great formulas on how to look at that. We referenced in the guide, in particular, Department of Transportation has a study where they use what they call an abbreviated injury scale, AIS, and talks you through the severity of injuries.
It would make sense that transportation would have to do that, right? To be able to justify, costs to upgrades to transportation infrastructure and its direct impact on injuries and loss of life. Sounds like a great resource.
Yeah, it really is. And I would encourage everybody to go there. We also do a reference to HHS and the way that they look at it as well. So it's there and it's linked in the guide. And I think it's a tremendously useful tool.
Two good resources.
Another thing kind of staying in this arena is when you're making that business case for security and you're looking at these non-quantifiable benefits and costs, it may also be useful to kind of break them out separately, especially when you're presenting them, Chris, to the C-suite or senior leadership, to where, you're showing on one side, these are all the security related benefits, costs, and here's all the non-security ones. That you might have. And again, you got to quantify all this in in language within your case study. How might, again, coming back to our case study that we've been talking about, how would that potentially look?
Yeah, Scott, so the case study, we came up with some pretty simple examples to use in the case study for non-quantified or monetized benefits. Without reading the slide to you, you can see that this analysis takes into account all stakeholders in both the security and lines of business of the facility. So our recommendation is going to improve security through reducing target attractiveness, vulnerability, and consequence in the event of a threat. And while accomplishing this, we expect to gain customer satisfaction and positively impact the well-being of our staff in the facility.
Then we hit the final step, step 9. This is where we're going to characterize the uncertainty in benefits, costs, or net benefits. Uncertainty is inherent with any forecast of future conditions. So the project team really has a responsibility to try to attempt to characterize what those sources may be, and develop a list of potential assumptions or scenarios that help analyze the potential impact of those scenarios. And I think this kind of comes back to those 6 elements we were talking to earlier, and we were talking about, anticipating resistance factors, so you're better able and better prepared to address them. So what are some uncertainties that we might be looking at in the security profession? So perhaps we've came in and we've said, we're going to put in, a new electronic security system somewhere. We're going to put a video surveillance system in somewhere. And our assumption is that if we do our preventative maintenance, that its life cycle is going to last for 7 years, right? But that's an uncertainty because maybe you got a lemon of a system and it's going to break down in 4 or 5 years. Or maybe there's changes in software, changes in technology, and it just doesn't stay up. We're uncertainty and risk, uncertainty and threat, right? You're building a project now based on what the current threat is, what the current risks are. You understand there's going to be variables in that, but there's an uncertainty on how much those variables may swing, and/or there's an uncertainty on what new or emerging risks may present themselves that you're not aware of. There's an uncertainty sometimes on how long you think you're going to stay in a facility. If you think you're only going to be there for 3 more years, and then at the 3-year mark, they turn around and do a 10-year lease. If you'd known you were going to be there 13 versus that 3 years, how might that have changed your approach? How might that have changed your analysis? So there's, what's your list of potential uncertainties, and how might those impact your analysis? And you want to just kind of include that in the totality of the project, because it speaks to how you're going to make certain decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it really becomes a credibility issue, right, Scott? I mean,
it is credibility. Yeah.
You don't want to be in delivery of your recommendation. It's your big day. It's your time to shine. Somebody brings up an issue of uncertainty, right? Like, have you considered how long we're going to be in this particular facility, or how long our lease is, or things like that? So important that you've thought through that, and you've documented it, and you're ready to answer any questions that might arise out of delivery. I mentioned the cost analysis template, the editable Excel files with the formulas built in. That's certainly one resource that's in the guide. There's a couple additional resources that I want to just highlight to kind of give you a flavor for the other types of things that are in there. So on the left, you see the DoD business case analysis template. What I like about that is it really encourages the user to incorporate other parts of the organization so that you can highlight the benefits across the entire enterprise. We've been talking about monetized and quantified and qualified costs and benefits. What I like about the Army Cost Benefit Analysis Guide is its ability to basically create a decision matrix by incorporating both quantitative and qualitative benefits and costs by assigning a numeric value to those qualitative benefits and costs to allow it to sort of compare green apples to red apples, if you will, qualified and quantified costs and benefits in a decision matrix.
Measuring success is super important for security organizations. You want to be able to show a positive return on investment to your leadership. we're talking earlier about the credibility, right? Because you're going to come back at some point and ask for money again, right? That's the nature of the beast. So if you've gone in and you've asked for money previously, one of the things you want to be able to do is demonstrate and measure the success of what you were doing, so that when you go back and ask for money again, right, leadership's going to see that they know that they're getting a return on investment, and you've got the credibility for doing that. Most organizations, when they do their measuring for success, they focus on qualitative or quantitative measurements. So, for example, quantitative benefits are those that can measure cost avoidance, cost reduction, cost savings. Your non-quantifiable attributes, you're representing values such as improved morale or satisfaction or quality. When you set out to develop your performance measurements, to me, I think one of the first things that you do, and one of the things that the working group talked about in the document, is that you have to set out what your objective is, right? What's your targets? You can't hit a target you can't see, right? So what does success look like? And so once you know, okay, we're here to improve X, Y, Z, or to reduce something, what you're looking for, then you can decide what type of category it kind of fits into. Is it quantifiable? Is it a non-quantifiable, or call it a quantitative versus quantitative measurement? And then you can go out and say, okay, these are the specific actions that we're going to take to measure success along the way, to make sure that we're on target, we're on time, we're on target, and that we can prove value and return on investment. So Chris, just coming back to our case study one more time, how might we measure success in the case scenario that we were talking about?
Absolutely. Before I do that, I'm gonna add one thing to your statements there. And it's really important to, when you're measuring for success, is you have to ensure that the measurements are made at the beginning, prior to installation of your project. Measure at your baseline so you know where you started. So if you forget to do that initial measurement step, you're going to miss out on growth opportunities. One of our goals was to increase staff productivity through this project. And on the quantitative side of our scenario, we'll be able to measure both visitor throughput at the screening lanes and the number of like late start or missed appointments within our facility. For a non-quantitative measurement, you may want to enhance customer satisfaction and organizational reputation. And you can accomplish this by looking at user surveys, customer surveys, and then also employee surveys. There's something I like to stress is not to forget about the stakeholders within the facility that are affected by your security decisions, because it's more than just the security office, it's more than the visitors. All of your staff in the facility are going to be affected by a security change, and you want to measure the impact on them as well.
All right. Well, I think if we go to the last slide, you've got plenty of time for questions. There is a Q&A pod. And so I'd encourage you to type in any of the questions you have in there. We will endeavor to answer them. I'll also, if we don't get some, I can share with you some questions, and I'll pose them to Scott and Chris, and ask them to do the same to me. Some questions that we've received in the past on this particular topic. So to learn more, you got the QR code on the left-hand side of your slide. That will take you to the guide. It will also take you to the Excel file. You can follow along kind of the case study, or you can delve into the 9-step business cost analysis approach. With that, I'm going to open the Q&A pod and see what questions we have. Is the presentation available to us? Let me ask our Homeland Security Today folks, is that something that you can make available as a follow-on?
I'm going to assume that this video is going to be posted on our YouTube page and within our and on our website and our video player.
Kyle, if you'd like it, maybe separately other than the video, we'll see what we can do. You could send a request to the ISC inbox.
And it's not a long document, sir. I think, going to the actual making a business case for security document is just the best thing that Kyle could do.
So another question, have you identified a good model by which to quantify customer satisfaction impacts? Scott or Chris, either you want to take that one?
I have not.
Is there a
I
resource in the document that speaks to customer satisfaction? We aware of that?
No, there's not.
There,
Not,
yeah,
not customer satisfaction.
Go ahead, Scott.
no, not that specifically. You know, at that granular of a level. No. One thing the document does talk about, and we kind of didn't, you know, kind of to expand a little bit, is when you're looking at customer satisfaction surveys, you have to have a before and after, right? So it's kind of like when you're looking at that baseline, when you're looking at your benefits, you have to have done some surveys pre-change and then post change, because you won't know if you've improved. So I think that's a key part to that. Again, knowing that that's something that you want to do. And then we haven't got, that's, you know, we can refer that to the best practice subcommittee perhaps, or some.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that brings to mind to me, Scott, is not only, you know, doing the survey ahead of time, but, you know, we talked about back in step one, describing the need, right? Like,
Right.
are there already existing surveys that are out there that your organization has done that point to a problem, right? So if
Mhm.
there are existing surveys in place, that is definitely something that you're going to want to consider. And I kind of gave you a list of things to consider when describing the need. That would definitely be one of them, and you want to get your hands on that. I'll throw another question out just for the group to consider. Reputation. How do you account for, and you know, a lot of times, especially in the private sector, how do you account for reputational costs and reputational benefits associated with, you know, either action or inaction? You get your thoughts on that.
I'll start off with it's a lot easier to lose reputation than to regain it or gain it. So it's like a weighted factor when you're trying to evaluate reputational effects of a security incident.
Now,
Maybe that'll lead Scott.
I mean, what comes to mind to me is the work that the team did on convergence. So one of the other best practices that have been done in about the last year and a half was a look at the need to converge or get unity of effort among security disciplines. And one of the resources that's in that document, and granted it's for a specific type of attack, is there have been studies done on the costs of cyber breaches, cyber related breaches. And one of the resources in the convergence document it will point you to are some historical analysis of what it costs as a result of that. And part of that, it speaks to what they had to do reputationally, to try to overcome those breaches. So, if you're looking to maybe consider, the cost in this case, to reputation, there's work out there that points to some very high profile events, and then the reputational costs associated with it.
Well, I think when you're looking at your different consequences, I think reputation, might very well be at play, especially depending on the type of mission. And if you look at our case study, clearly we're showing a mission that brings public into your space in some way. And so I think that your reputation is part of that consequence analysis that you end up having to do. So Daryl, let me throw one at you. 9 steps to do a benefit cost analysis, right? And there's a lot of work to get you through those 9 steps, but so often it seems like security world is reactionary. They're reacting to a scenario or reacting to something that's occurring. And so, you've got a compressed timeline to come up with something for leadership, right? So do you really have time to sit and methodically go through all 9 steps and in a way that we just presented it, like, we have all the time in the world, right? So, if you're under the gun and you're trying to produce something quickly, where can you squish on that, maybe, or what steps or have a higher priority or more importance than others?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about reacting to a real world incident, right? You
Yeah,
have something that's
absolutely.
happened,
Yeah.
your threats increased, you had an incident. There's at that point, the environment may have changed to where you're not having to convince people to do something. They've been convinced because you had a real world incident or you've had your threats increased. And so part of your challenge in making the business case has been taken care of for you, right? Because you now have an imperative for action. So what I would recommend in those instances, a couple things. Number one, stick with the basic 6 steps, right? If you don't have time to do a benefit cost analysis, and if you don't have a need to do a benefit cost analysis, because essentially the decision's been made, maybe the threats have increased, you've got money coming at you, you're expected to figure out how to get it obligated and implemented. Then go back to the 6 steps that we started with. That's number one. The second thing is, to the extent that you do need to delve into the benefit cost analysis, I don't think it will be as detailed, right? I think if you're dealing with in a reactionary mode, where you're having to do this in real time, under the gun, under pressure, you're probably not going to get quite as detailed, perhaps, is what we showed today.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you got to make sure that you're doing also is that life cycle of what you're putting in, right? So often it's, hey, we're going to do this, and our cost to implement is X, right? But then you're going back to leadership later and going, okay, we put that in place, but to sustain that, what you want us to do is going to cost us even more down the road. So even though that might not be right up front, I think it's got to come pretty quick, right? Because otherwise you end up getting a lot of systems out there that deteriorate over time because they were put in place and then we didn't do our maintenance, to retain it.
So Tom provided some helpful thoughts in the Q&A on customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
You see that done in a number of ways, everything from, like a short survey. There's technology that can help you out with that in terms of, linked maybe to the individual's phone, where they get texted a survey, all the way to, if you've been in some airports, you get the smiley faces and the frowny faces buttons, that they ask you to push on your way out. So lots of ways to get at that. Diane Wiggins is asking, do you know of any standards or information that suggests the minimum number of security staff per employee or organization?
Appendix C to our Armed Security Officers Guide.
Security Officers Guide?
Yeah, if you go on that link on our slide there, go to our Armed Security Officers Guide, Appendix C. It actually talks about what your security staffing might look like, in terms of, what I'm reading when you say, Diane, when you say security staff, I'm reading guards in this particular instance. There's another document out there about physical security, again, on our website, about physical security staffing and how that might look in a broader perspective from your back office folks. But what I'm reading is, it looks like you're talking about guards.
Yeah. Thanks. Cyber.
So cyber. Minimum number.
Cyber
perspective,
cyber staff
really
per employee. Yeah, I'd have to have some more context, I think, Diane, for that. Let's see. Go down here.
So what about entities concerned about insider threats, but they're not sure how much of the screening process for visitors should be applied to employees?
So that's a really great question. Personally, I'm a fan of random employee screening, right? I really am. It's something that the ISC recommends as one of its countermeasures. It doesn't mandate it, but it does recommend it. And I'm a huge fan of that, because I think random screening goes a long way to helping to mitigate insider threat issues and workplace violence issues, actually.
You know,
Right.
that's, if you go to the website there, you'll find facility access control and interagency security committee best practice. And that talks about actually some techniques for random employee screening that Scott hit on.
And it's important to know that, if your risk assessment identifies insider threat as a high risk item for your facility and your mission, then you would be perfectly justified in sending all your employees through full screening if you wanted to. That's the tie-in, is your risk assessment to the security.
Yeah, and implementing the different criteria under, that are applicable to that as a undesirable event that we call them, or the threat, right? So.
And you've got to balance this, right? You got to balance that with what's the cost to productivity, and what's the cost to employee transit time to and from work. But keeping that all balanced. Bridget, did you have another question?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to bounce a question off what Daryl was talking about with reactionary security. So how would the person or team who is developing an analysis deal with higher ups' desire to invest in security ebbing and flowing with the threat cycle? They only get excited about it after a high profile attack. When you've done your analysis, how do you keep it from rising or falling influenced by current emotions?
So I'll give you a real world example, but I will keep the names of the folks out of this. We had an agency that, due to the news cycle and current events, was experiencing a significant increase in threats, both to their facilities, to their personnel, and in some instances, those threats were acted on, at employees' cars, at the facilities, and the employees themselves. And so, their leadership became very attuned to security at that point in time. This particular organization was not a security wasn't their main service delivery. Customer service of the American citizens was their main mission. And because of that, they needed to be able to maintain an open and accessible posture. And what they did was spot on. One, they solicited some help, right? And we were happy to be a part of that. But Federal Protective Service and a number of other entities were a part of that. And they were very smart about it, in that they were faced with a scenario where management wanted to take action. There were resources that were freed up, and then how best to apply those resources. And from an enterprise or a portfolio perspective, they prioritize the risk, right? They prioritize the risk, looking at their facilities that had the largest number of personnel working there and had the most exposure to the American public. They prioritize risk based on how long has it been since our last risk assessment. Did we have a recent one, or was there one that's old and we need to get back out there maybe and do an out of cycle risk assessment? So they prioritize it by risk. To answer your question, they sought expertise, and in terms of their implementation, it all appears to be going very, very well because of the approach that they took, right? Which was how do we do this in a responsible way? And how do we get the biggest return on investment for these dollars that have been freed up for us?
That's great. Thank you.
Scott, I want to throw one last question, at least from my perspective, and then if you, Chris, have any you want to throw out there. There were parts of the 6 steps, and there are certainly parts of the 9-step cost benefit analysis piece that are more or less technical, which I think a reasonable question to ask is, at the end of the day, who was the audience for this making a business case for security? I mean, who were you hoping to write this for?
Yeah, so the working group, really, they worked hard to write this to security professionals, right? That are out there, trying to develop and design these projects. And I'll be honest, there was a lot of work that went into bringing it from language that an economist or a financial person would fully understand into the realm of the security world, so a Neanderthal like me could understand it a little bit. So they're the target audience as well as leadership, right, for the organization, so that they can look at it and encourage or influence the use of the methodical approach to getting funding for security measures within their organization. But it's really designed for that security professional at the headquarters or facility level that's trying to develop justification for the security measures that they're recommending.
Yeah.
And I would tell you, if you're working it and you're doing it and you have the opportunity to reach out to an economist in your organization, bring them in, because the use of the economists and having financial members part of the working group was extremely beneficial in getting certain pieces right, and understanding the process by which that you're going to go through to achieve the funding and achieving success. But it's designed for the security organization to help that security organization fight for those resources that they have to compete for with all the other priorities that exist within the organization.
So if you're a security professional and you're watching this and you think, well, some of those things sound a little bit out of my lane, that's okay. Just because you may be out of your lane doesn't mean that we don't want you to know about them, and that we don't want you to understand that they can be done by by an economist, by a budget person. Scott, I know you had economists on this working groups as well. And if you're a leader and you're watching this, know that there's a process, right? There's a process that a diverse group of security professionals and economists and budget folks came up with as a framework to consider. And so I agree with you, Scott. Security professionals definitely are the focus of this effort at the organization and facility level, and leaders, right? And what they can do. I see.
I think you made a good point too about it. It's a guide, right? This is a best practice to guide you through a process, right? It's the process. I think it's what you learn about the project and will everything line up specifically, as it shows in the guide? Probably not. There's not a cookie cutter approach that probably matches exactly, but it guides you through that process that's going to allow you to do the analysis that's going to give you credibility.
So thanks, Scott. We got a question from Sean Mooney. In the interest of being as proactive as possible, what recommendations do you have regarding justifying investment based on how we expect the threat to evolve in the future? So projecting out, and then he adds investment objectives could include becoming more agile and automated in preparation for threats that will occur in the future. I'll give you my first whack at that. And then I'll let Scott or Chris add any of their thoughts on there. Two things come to mind, Sean, when I see that question. One is the time horizon, right? Like what are we looking at in terms of time horizon? The second, going back to step two, is that risk assessment. How do we expect that risk to change over time? You know, in terms of justifying investments based on future threat landscape, we've got to follow a lot of the same techniques that we talked about here, right? We got to understand what it is today, what's the risk today, what is the risk in time in the future, be able to show that, and then be able to articulate, you know, the need for the investment. Back to the agile and automated piece of this. One of our agencies is in the business of response, and as part of their and really response and recovery both, and as part of their response and recovery missions, they have to go into sometimes austere environments. They have to establish facilities to operate out of, and they obviously have to provide security for their personnel as a part of that. And one of the things that they have saved a significant amount of money on over time, and they've been able to demonstrate this savings to their headquarters, is moving as quickly as possible from a labor-based security force to intrusion detection and access control, right? To go to more of an automated. And they did a very good job of you know, kind of sharing that with our membership recently, but also to demonstrate to their leadership, you know, what are those change? How much have we saved over time, and then how quickly can we get some of these automated tools in place so that we can begin that cost savings? Chris, you want to jump in there?
I think you answered it pretty well there. My only add-on would be to provide trend analysis when you're going to do proactive and look into the future for threats, is to, you know, show what's been happening and where it's headed, and use that as your basis for justification.
Yeah, and show that whatever you're proposing to put in place is in fact capable and flexible and agile enough to respond to whatever that, you know, that's going to be. So
right, there are definitely scalable security solutions out there for different threats. So if you can build on it to address the current threat and say, like, this can be scalable to the future threat, that's another option for you.
yeah, absolutely.
Scott, Chris, any other common questions that you've heard on this topic that you want to share?
I don't really have any more. We've hit quite a few that we've discussed over time. Yeah.
Can I jump in with one more?
Sure.
So what about entities that are conflicted with how much they should be devoting to physical versus cybersecurity, especially if there are limited resources to play with?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets us back to the whole question of convergence, right? Ideally, we're not looking at this as a zero-sum game. Unfortunately, we do have silos of excellence in some organizations, and you do get these discussions about physical versus cyber, where we think where we would like to see the conversation taking place is more of an enterprise approach, where we're looking at risk, we're looking at the physical and the cyber and the operational technology risk associated with that, and then we're addressing that risk together instead of you know, our physical and cyber silos of excellence. That's my my plug for, you know, convergence and for enterprise security in response to that question. Chris, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's great. I mean, you're talking to security guys who just say fund it all. Right? And that's why we came up with the business case for security, so we could evaluate these different alternatives and course of action to show where you're going to have risk remaining if you if you address one area over another. I think cyber is very important, but I also think physical is also is very important, and the convergence of the two is making them just intertwined, like Daryl said.
Scott, anything more?
I wouldn't want to add on that. That's good.
All right, well, Bridget, I think we're rounds complete.
We got one more in the Q&A if
All
you
right.
grab that
Okay.
from Mike Ortega.
Are there any studies or guidance on how to make security count?
More palatable to employees.
Culture of security, right? That's what the first thing that it comes through my through my mind. And it's interesting, in terms of having security be part of the organization's culture, having employees understand their role in security. I mentioned that example where the threats went up, and again, not a security organization. There were a lot of people that were concerned about security, employees and others, in a response to that. And what they actually had the reverse problem, I think, that your question describes, and we've also seen this from other entities as a result, in terms of employees that are in some high crime areas, is the flip side of that question is, how do you assure the populace, or your populace, how do you assure your employee population that they can take actions to secure themselves, like that security is they can affect their own security, right? Security is within their reach, within their grasp, to improve. And our agency has developed a number of products in regards to this that we share freely with our counterparts. Everything from how to de-escalate a situation, how to if there is a situation where maybe employees and customers are in a situation where they feel uncomfortable, or their security might be risked. So de-escalation products, you can find those on the CISA website. You search de-escalation and CISA to Power of Hello. Where's the employee's role in terms of employee vigilance? You can find those resources there. To how to take some basic steps as a non-security person to enhance your security, awareness, not being on your phone, where your surroundings. When you hear things like that as a security professional, a lot of times your reaction, your emotional reaction is, look both ways before you cross the street and don't run with scissors. And that might be the case for a security professional. But when you're talking about a workforce or a group of folks who are not by trade security folks, those types of products mean a lot and can help out a lot in terms of the confidence that they inspire.
So I think the other thing with that too is a little bit counterintuitive, and that is what I'd call investment in security, right? So security awareness, but how do you get them invested into security? And some of that, we talked about building the project team, and when doing so, including representation from those lines of business that are going to be impacted, right? And I know I've had opportunity a lot of times to observe where we went in and we put a new security process in place. And then the employees came in and they were like, well, nobody talked to us about it. Nobody told us about it. You just sprung this on it. It's got this kind of impact on us, because now you're requiring us to, we can't escort any more than 4 visitors, let's say, where we used to could escort 10. Was that vetted with them? Were they part of the decision-making process? So they're invested in what's happening within their own facility. So I think sometimes, and of course, that's always a balance, because then you say, well, if I bring them in, they're going to want us to do nothing, right? Because it's easier for them, and that's not always true. You just kind of feel that way as a security professional, that you feel like everybody's pushing back on you. But if they're invested and they're part of the conversation, then I think it becomes more palatable to them, and they're able to understand. It's like change management, right? What's the first thing you have to do with change? You got to create that felt need if you want employees to accept change. So how do you get employees to accept security procedures? It's them understanding and being a part of the why, I think.
Scott, would you say like even employee unions might be stakeholders that need to be engaged?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, talking with the union representatives, there's definitely times where you'd want to have that reach out with them, right? And get their buy-in, get their support, right? We talked about random employee screening before. Certainly that would be something that you would maybe want to consider taking that to your HR, whoever within your own organization, and saying, we want to do random employee screening. We'd like to talk this through with the union and get their backing on it, get their support on it. And I think that would make things easier for you. But that's, everything is the landscape changes. You have to read it every time. But I think getting their investment into the process, might be something that would help as well.
Yeah, either on the front end or at least just part of a rollout plan, right? Part of a communication plan of
communication plans. Yeah, that's a big one too, right? Nobody told me, even though you've got signs all over the place saying starting on this day we're going to start doing X, right? But if you're relying solely on somebody reading a sign you put on a door, you're probably not going to get there, right?
Hopefully that helped your question, sir. All right, Bridget.
All right. Well,
others.
Thank you, Daryl, Scott, and Chris. This was an extremely fruitful and discussion that covered a lot of bases. And like I said earlier, this video will be available for people to revisit and, watch with their extended security teams as well, so that a lot of people can benefit from what was discussed here today. So if there's nothing else here, then I think we're going to wrap it up. Any last words from you, gentlemen?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget.
Yeah, thank you. Take a picture of the QR code, download the document, more information in it.
Yes, definitely visit the links that ISC has provided, and hope you got to have you guys on again at some other time. And thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.